Alexei
Pajitnov.
Pajitnov. I've been saying it wrong all this time. Maybe that's why he lied to me. So the first time I interviewed him, he told me, I said, well, did you make anything for this? And I think he was still in Soviet Union when he said this, or still in Russia, because I think it was the 80s. He said, no, all I got was PC. He got a 286 PC. On my most recent interview with him, he said, no, I got more. But I think that's what he got, right? You tell me.
Well, it's what did he get originally?
He was really happy to have a 286, as I remember.
Well, back then, that was gold. People wait in line for bread and PCs in Russia.
Yeah.
Originally, he got nothing because the Soviets came in and they said, well, we own all this. So if a Western businessman wants to come in and negotiate for some rights, well, they're going to talk to us. And they had an organization that eventually took over the software licensing called Elektromagorskaya. I'm fumbling that name too, but the abbreviation was ELORG, which sounds like an evil James Bond organization, and sort of acted the same way as this big overlord group that everyone had to like find and negotiate with, the big bear-like Russian guy. His name was Nikolai Belikov, and you had to get through him if you wanted like arcade rights for Tetris or renegotiated PC rights. And all these Western companies had been buying and selling and swapping and trading rights. But the Russians never recognized the legitimacy of that first deal to do that. So according to the Soviet Union, everyone who was buying and selling Tetris was doing it under false pretenses and owed them a lot of money.
So how did it leak out? You said through Hungary, and then when did Spectrum Holobyte get a hold of it?
So there was a Hungarian native who was a UK naturalized citizen named Robert Stein, and he went to the Eastern Bloc countries occasionally to find basically cheap software that was being made behind the Iron Curtain that he could export to the West and resell at a slight profit. Perfectly reasonable business model. He saw Tetris somewhere and said, hey, this sounds pretty interesting. I should try to get this. And the Hungarians told him, well, it's actually not ours. It belongs to this Russian research group and this guy. So he said, all right, I'm going to throw, I'm going to try to get in touch with these guys and see what they say. So he sent them a telex, which is like a primitive version of a fax. It's a very Cold War-esque version of a fax machine, a telex machine, and just said, hey, I'm interested in licensing your game. But, that message kind of went into a black hole back in Moscow. They had to find it. They had to translate it, give it to the right guy. Alexei Pajitnov eventually got it. Then he had to get tons of permissions to get a reply translated and then resent. The whole thing took months. And he said, yeah, I'm interested in this deal. To the Russians, that was just saying, thanks for the interest and maybe we'll negotiate with you. To Robert Stein, that meant you're agreeing to the deal kind of as I outlined, and that's it. I'm your licensor now, and I'm going to go out and sell this game. So there was a little bit of a Cold War miscommunication there, depending on who you want to believe. And he, of course, turned around and sold it to Microsoft and Spectrum Holobyte, who then relicensed it to Sega and Atari and all these other companies.
So to be fair to them, Spectrum Holobyte and Microsoft, they thought they were buying the rights legitimately.
Yeah, they all had the idea that this came from this in-between guy, this go-between who worked with Eastern Bloc companies, frequently. So we're not going to ask any questions. He's telling us he's got the rights. We're just going to believe him. Maybe we're not going to dig too deeply into it. But they felt at least reasonably confident legally that they were in the right, although that turned out to not be quite as cut and dried as they thought.
How much money did Tetris end up making Spectrum Holobyte and Microsoft in the early days, and how much of that got to the Soviet Union, and how much of that got to Alexei Pajitnov?
At the beginning, it was a cult hit. People would see it at CES back in the 80s.
I know, I remember. Or Comdex. It was in those days, yeah.
Yes. And a guy named Hank Rogers, who's one of the main characters in the book, saw it there, and he wanted to license it for the Japanese market where he worked, and also for Nintendo consoles, which were just starting to be really big. Before that, it was on PC. Cult Hit did make a ton of money, but it was okay. But the Russians didn't see any of that. They kept turning around and going,
"Where's the money?
Where's our checks?" And then when Nintendo came into the picture, that was the promise of some really big money. So the Russians were very paranoid about whether anything would get back to them. Of course, at this point, none of it is getting back to Alexei Pajitnov. He's just a cog in the Soviet wheel. We're going to have to wait for the Soviet Union to collapse in the early 90s before he gets a turn to at least try to get back in the game.
Yeah, I mean, that's just the way it was. You didn't collect royalties for anything. That's the way the system works.
They don't know what intellectual property licensing is.
Right. So it really didn't break out until Nintendo got it.
That was sort of the jump between cult hit and real mainstream. Nintendo at the same time was working on a top secret project that eventually came to be called the Game Boy. It was a really revolutionary idea, almost Apple-like in its enforced minimalism. It was less advanced than other handheld gaming systems. It had a black and white screen. It just had like these 2 buttons and this 1 D-pad. It ran on AA batteries, which was huge. And it was a real bold attempt to make something that people could just carry around with them and wasn't too complicated, wouldn't be too expensive. But what game do you pack in with it? Because back then you would pack in games. Nintendo was like, oh, we'll put Mario in there, or Zelda, or Donkey Kong. And Hank Rogers, who was friends with Minoru Arakawa, who was the guy who founded Nintendo of America and is a very pivotal key person in video game history, Hank Rogers went to him and said, listen, if you put Mario in, only boys who are already Nintendo fans are going to buy this device. If you want everyone to buy this device, put in something different. How about this Tetris game I'm getting the Japanese licensing rights for? Maybe we could do that. And it's a little bit of a Rashomon style story where everyone claims that was their idea. That's Hank Rogers' version of that story.
I trust Hank. I think Hank was kind of brilliant fella.
Oh, my, so brilliant, and also such an interesting guy. I describe him as being a bit of a software anthropologist in that he was able to go across different cultures and find software and find games that he thought would work in this country or that country and import it and regionalize it for Japan or wherever he was. And he had a really good feel for that, and that's how he became a big software magnate in Japan, despite not even speaking Japanese.
Tetris, and he had a great insight, which is not immediately obvious. If you watch somebody playing Tetris, it doesn't, it's not graphically that interesting. It doesn't, how compelling it is doesn't come out unless you actually play it, and probably play it for a little bit then you get hooked, of course. And he had a great insight, which is that it was the small mobile version of Tetris that was going to be the killer. Not the desk. Nobody wants to play Tetris. I mean, maybe we do now, but play Tetris at a desktop computer or even a laptop. It's mobile that makes so much sense. Right around this time, I mean, you could buy mobile poker games. You'd see people in the airport on a game playing these, or little football games. These were all kind of purpose-built, dedicated little game things. So the Game Boy really hit at a perfect time for this.
It did, and this was the perfect combination of like kind of the killer app concept, the perfect software with just the right hardware, because Tetris was simple enough. You could put it on this little monochromatic screen with just 2 buttons to control it, and it actually worked. It actually made sense. And if it were not for that combination, we may not be talking, we probably wouldn't be talking about Tetris in the same way now. This really kicked it off. And then right after that, they put it on the Nintendo Entertainment System in the US and the Famicom in Japan, which is what it was called there. And that became an even bigger hit in the short term and sold, tens and tens of millions of copies.
So, interesting. So it did do very well on the Famicom as well.
Oh, it was huge, and that's really where the big, eventually, this whole thing culminates in a gigantic court battle between Nintendo and one of the versions of Atari that split off from the original company. And it became called Tengen, and they both wanted to make NES versions of Tetris, and who had the rights to it? That went all the way back to the Russians, back to the original contract, back to what the definition of a computer was, back to all this infighting between Robert Maxwell and that guy Robert Stein and Hank Rogers and Elorg. It all came to a head in a dramatic courtroom, kind of scene.
Where was the court? Was it in the U.S. or was it in?
This was in the U.S.
This was in the U.S. And how do you untangle this?
It was a huge thing. Well, they had to worry about getting all these Russian expert witnesses out of the Soviet Union to come to the U.S. to testify. And because Robert Maxwell, the UK media baron, was literally friends with Gorbachev, he called Gorbachev about this. Like they had conversations about Tetris, where Maxwell said to Gorbachev, "Listen, you got to get these Nintendo guys out of here. My company is getting screwed in this big battle over who owns the rights to Tetris." And Gorbachev said, "Don't worry about that. I'll take care of it." And then, history overtook Gorbachev, and he never got a chance to step on put a foot on the scale for Robert Maxwell. But the people in charge in the Soviet Union knew that Robert Maxwell and Murasov, by extension, were the favorites of Gorbachev and the ruling party. So everyone was afraid they would make it very difficult for these Russians, including Alexei Pajitnov, to get out of the country. And you had to sit there and wonder, are they going to show up to court? Are they going to be able to get their papers to fly? So
at this point, Pajitnov knows what's going on.
Yeah, they keep him in the loop. If you want to come in and license Tetris, you have to go sit down in the meeting with Elorg. Pajitnov comes in as kind of an advisor and the creator of the game, but he doesn't actually make the call or any of the money right then.
So I'm glad he's not completely left out. He's not, but he's still not making any money on this.
He's not. And then Hank Rogers goes to Moscow. There's one pivotal week that sort of opens the book. It's like a spy thriller where Hank Rogers, Robert Maxwell's son, and Robert Stein all raced to Moscow during the same week in like 1989, and they're all trying to have this meeting with Elorg. And Maxwell and Stein have invites. They're going to go have actual meetings. Hank Rogers doesn't have a meeting, doesn't know where their office is, has not been invited, sneaks into Moscow on a tourist visa, and basically has to spy his way around Moscow to find where these guys are and then talk his way through the door and then beat out these other two big businessmen in like these one-to-one negotiations. And during that week, he manages to talk his way through the door. He meets Alexei Pajitnov, and the two of them become friends right away because they're both software guys, they're both game programmers. They realize they're kindred spirits, and they start hanging out, and they form this partnership, this professional and personal partnership that continues, today, almost 30 years later.
Yeah. It's what's amazing is here we are playing, and it's the Cold War. It's encapsulated in this little game. I mean, this is international geopolitics, including Gorbachev. It's just kind of an amazing story.